Short Fat Otaku tweets, new video examining the phrase, everything is political. Mummified Gamer tweets, there are so many things I disagree with towards the end of this video that I had to stop watching lest my brain exploded. Dev takes fence sitting to a whole new level. Anita Sarkeesian was right. Dev 2024. Short Fat Otaku also tweets, I'm not afraid to say the phrase, Anita Sarkeesian was right, those rare times that Anita Sarkeesian was actually right. Yeah, I wouldn't think the sky was green if Anita told me it was blue either. So yes, Short Fat Otaku is in fact arguing that Anita Sarkeesian was right about everything being political. Hello everyone, Ace here, and today let's talk about how Short Fat Otaku is wrong about arguing that everything is political. Or as he tried to frame it, everything has an impact on real politics. Which is of course another way of saying that someone can interpret political meaning from something, and this somehow inherently makes that thing political. So yes, apparently something can have an explicit political message just because enough people say it does. Let's apply this logic elsewhere, shall we, for a moment. If enough progressives argue that Dev is a Nazi or promotes Nazism, does that mean that Dev himself actually promotes Nazism? I ask because those are the exact same standards being utilized to justify the notion that everything is political just because a bunch of progressives say everything is political. This is a notion that, for the record, Dev's own comments in his own YouTube video ultimately contradict, as when Tricky Mario stated, quote, shoving politics into non-political things is guaranteed to be a turnoff, Short Fat Otaku responded by stating, quote, unfortunately everything is actually political, but the liberals' right of free association means you are under no obligation to engage with the politics of a thing. A TV show might have a political message, but it's completely valid just to watch the show for fun, and people who tell you that you're watching it wrong are just busybodies sticking their noses where they don't belong. Because, as stated by Zizinorek, quote, there is a contradiction between everything is political and it is possible to engage with a thing without engaging with the politics of a thing. Proof. Assume you are engaging with a thing without engaging with the politics of that thing. Now consider just the part you are engaging with. By everything is political, just that part taken alone is still political. And Zizinorek is of course completely correct in this assessment. Though another individual, specifically Governor Transalpine Gaul, responded with, quote, you're taking a simplified premise and interpreting it too literally. It's not everything is political, it's everything has a political component. Of course, Governor Transalpine Gaul is apparently completely oblivious to the fact that if everything has a political component, then those things that make up a larger thing must themselves also have political components, resulting in Zizinorek being completely correct still, even if you choose to agree with Governor Transalpine Gaul's interpretation of everything is political. And that's not the only criticism to be had either, as Itchy Pterodactyl responds by stating, quote, Dev is still wrong. He's conflating the idea that everything could be political or could be politicized with everything is inherently and by its nature political. Whether this is in whole or in part doesn't affect the reality of this conflation. This of course wraps right back around to the original critique that I brought up with regards to Dev's position here, that being that Dev must be, by these exact same standards, a Nazi or promote Nazism just because a bunch of progressives have interpreted his work to do so. And there are still other criticisms to be made about the mindset of everything being political as well, such as, for example, the fact that the everything is political mindset fundamentally requires taking up the position that failing to make a political statement is itself fundamentally making a political statement, specifically in favor of the status quo. And consider, if you will, for a moment, that this applies to any and all political topics that exist or could potentially exist. In other words, it's not just that progressives believe that everything is political, but also that everything is making at all times a political statement about literally every single political topic that exists or theoretically could exist. Why this debunks Dev's position is that if you were to try to simply have fun and enjoy a piece of media while believing that everything is political, well, you're still making a political statement by apparently enjoying that piece piece of media, and are therefore willfully pushing any status quo positions that may exist at the time, by simply claiming that the particular components of the media you enjoy aren't themselves political, even though you believe that literally everything, including those components, are political. In other words, despite Dev's claims that this would be just moral busybodying and he could therefore counter by claiming it's just moral busybodying, that doesn't really work when he's already taken up the position that him just enjoying something for fun inherently violates the natural rights of others. Oh yeah, on that subject, arguing everything is political also fundamentally means arguing that Jack Thompson was right about video games causing violence. Because if everything has an impact on real-world politics, then that means you could literally argue that anything results in a 0.00001% increase in people becoming politically radicalized, and thus engaging in politically motivated violence. And this is why the everything is political mindset is fundamentally anti-liberal, and yet another example of Dev being fundamentally anti-liberal in terms of his beliefs. Because the classical liberal mindset is that your rights end where the rights of another's begin. So if your speech results, statistically speaking, in someone else dying, well, that means that your speech has violated their natural right to life. And at that point, the moral foundation of abolishing things like free speech and individual rights have been thoroughly laid. Now granted, you can argue that this loss of life would be minuscule and not in value in proportion to the loss of free speech. However, that is a significantly weaker argument to make than pointing out the fact that this is a completely nonsensical position to take, specifically and exclusively because you and you alone chose to enjoy a piece of media in an apolitical manner. So if you were to follow Dev's arguments and reasoning here, it would fundamentally weaken the liberal position of private spaces because everything is political, and therefore the fact that your rights end where others begin means that statistically speaking, if you say anything whatsoever that has a 0.000000001% chance of causing harm or death to another individual, well, if you believe everything is political, then you don't actually believe that your speech is protected within the principles of liberal values then. Especially if you believe that not having an opinion is automatically supporting the status quo, and therefore supporting a particular political position. On that subject, another contradiction I should point out because of this is the fact that if you truly believe that everything is political, then arguing that it's not that deep is not actually seceding ground to the progressives. It is in fact making an actual counter argument. Because again, arguing that something isn't inherently political is, to the mind of someone that believes that everything is political, fundamentally arguing that that thing instead supports the status quo. Just because you don't understand the bigger picture implications of your own argument doesn't actually mean that you aren't making that argument. But of course, this does quite cleanly move me on to another point that I need to bring up with the everything is political idea. That being that the status quo itself changes over time, which would mean that if you believe that not having an opinion means supporting the status quo, then that means that any piece of media where you make this argument has pushed very different politics depending on what year you're talking about. A book, for example, that was made in the 1890s and makes no explicit comments about the rights of women at that time would, according to the everything is political crowd, fundamentally deny women's rights. Yet, in this day and age, that book, interpreted with the modern status quo, would fundamentally support a system that discriminates in favor of women. And I know what you're thinking. I'm talking about a hypothetical book that was written in the 1890s, therefore I shouldn't be using it with the modern political lens. But that's the thing, if you believe everything is political, then you must interpret everything with a current political lens, as well as paradoxically interpret it with potentially historic and future lenses as well at the exact same time, because again, it must be making status quo arguments. And since the status quo has changed from the 1890s to the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1950s, the 1970s, and finally the 2020s, well, all of those interpretations must simultaneously be valid political interpretations, no matter how fundamentally contradictory that they are. And if you think that the everything is political mindset doesn't transcend time and space in order for itself to remain correct, then consider that anything that existed prior to humanity was, at least at that time, not political, simply on the grounds of predating humanity itself. Except if you believe that, then you believe that not everything is political, and that not everything has an impact on real-life politics. Except that simply cannot be the case if you believe that everything is political and that everything everything has a political component. So the argument that everything is political means that the politics must transcend time itself. A caveman from 500,000 years ago making fire is clearly making a political statement about the usage of artificial intelligence in the year 2024 AD, because everything is political. Everything is making a political statement about everything at all times. And if you argue that a caveman from 500,000 years ago making fire isn't making a political statement about the usage of AI in the year 2024, well, you've just completely discredited the notion that literally everything is political, or that everything has a political component. So I believe I've made my point very clear on why Dev is completely fucking insane in arguing that everything is political, that Anita Sarkeesian was right about politics in video games, and also that Jack Thompson was somehow right about video games causing violence, because again, to argue that everything is political means ultimately arguing that Jack Thompson was right too. But there is one other argument that Dev makes that I am going to also have to address here, that being the notion that everything is political is ultimately what has caused the progressives to become so successful in the culture wars. It is true that the progressives did gain a fair amount of ground early on. However, I would have to not only say that it wasn't the fact that they believed everything is political that led to this, but instead it's the argument that everything is political that has led directly to their subsequent downfall. I would say that a more accurate interpretation of the whole situation is that the progressives had for a time a symbiotic relationship with the establishment. The establishment benefited greatly from having the woke progressives ultimately undermining the whole Occupy movement back in the day. The progressives were a very convenient political tool to undermine political dissidents for a while. And of course, the progressives benefited from having a significantly larger say in society than they otherwise would have, thanks again to their alliance with the establishment. Or to put it another way, Anita Sarkeesian and Zoe Quinn did not make it to speaking at the UN just exclusively by arguing that everything is political. That took favors from the establishment in order to accomplish. So let's move on to why I believe that arguing that everything is political ultimately led directly to the downfall of the progressives. To start off, for reasons that I have already explained, arguing that everything is political ultimately means being utterly unable to pick and choose your own battles, because failing to have an opinion on something is automatically supporting the status quo. A natural consequence of this is that believing in everything is political ultimately means believing in compelled speech, that you must have an opinion on something, regardless of how well informed or not you may be, because not having an opinion is just simply supporting the status quo. This fundamentally led to progressives picking some of the very worst hills possible to die on, such as, for example, progressives arguing that black people are all orcs from D&D, because remember, everything must have an impact on real-life politics, and if you believe that, then you believe that the depiction of orcs in D&D fundamentally has an impact on race relations within the US. In other words, it was utterly inevitable that progressives were going to be extremely racist and come to the conclusion that orcs must depict a group of real-life people. The only thing really up for debate at that point is which group they believed that orcs were going to depict. Another consequence of arguing that everything is political, a consequence that worked against the progressives, is that it made escapism a thing of the past. As a result, the normie has become an increasingly rare and endangered species among men. And in the place of the normie are an increasing number of people who have an increasingly invested interest in opposing progressives in order to restore the escapism that they have lost. And considering the alliance that the establishment has had with the progressives, this has meant that the establishment has also ended up making far more enemies as a result as well, turning an ever-increasing larger percentage of the general populace against them as a result. But then we move on to the final straw that absolutely accelerated the downfall of the progressives, that being that arguing everything is political meant that the progressives would end up inevitably turning on the establishment and vice versa. This finally came to a head back in October of 2023, when the progressives began to openly celebrate a certain terrorist organization that had recently conducted a terrorist attack against a certain country that the establishment has decreed to be beyond any and all critique. It appears appears to have been at that moment that the establishment finally has had enough of the progressives, and have begun to actively kick them like the bad habit that they are. And again, this was, at its core, directly as a result of the progressives arguing that everything is political. This was ultimately a consequence of that. Sometimes you just simply have to know when to pick and choose your battles, and the fundamental incapability to do so by the progressives was, strategically speaking, their greatest folly period. To therefore try to argue that we should emulate their successes early on by making their gravest mistake possible is beyond insane. It will lead only to the exact same failure that the progressives are experiencing now. There is no outcome in which this ends up as a positive gain for someone like Dev, or indeed anyone who seriously wishes to argue that everything is political. Not only is it simply incorrect to argue that everything is political for the various reasons that I have pointed out, but it is a strategically disastrous idea that should be avoided at all costs. With that said, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.